It is true that after centuries of entrenched inequality, democracy in Britain accelerated at a remarkable rate during the 19th century. Can you tell me why?
I bet it involves the Chartists.
Partially correct.
Always with the Chartists.
But even the Chartists wouldn't have existed without one crucial factor.
The cities?
It was all due to the growth of the cities. And one particular city, Newport in South Wales, played host to a seismic event in the history of British democracy, the last large-scale violent uprising the United Kingdom has seen. I'm Luke Pearce, and this is the Radical History channel, where we bring to light the people throughout history who risked everything for the social, economic and democratic rights we enjoy today. We tend to think of 18th and 19th century cities as depressing places, but without them we wouldn't have anything like the democratic rights we sometimes take for granted in the West. It's true that the rapid growth of cities such as Manchester, which grew from a village to one of the largest cities in the world within the span of a single lifetime, led to problems such as overcrowding and disease. But it was in these burgeoning cities that two important developments occurred that would not have been possible anywhere else. The first important development was education. In the countryside, landowners controlled every aspect of their workers' lives, including access to knowledge. When those workers moved to the cities, they came into contact with books, newspapers, and radical ideas, and they could meet in larger groups than ever before to exchange those ideas. The second development was more to do with perception. Once they'd moved to the city, the workers realised for the first time how greatly they outnumbered the middle and upper classes. A rural landowner's personal regiment could easily have contained more soldiers than a worker would see in an entire year. But in the cities, workers could recognise their collective potential. This gave them confidence. They started to meet and plan how to put their ideas for a fairer society into practice. Calls for what we now recognise as democratic rights began growing in Britain as ordinary people realised the level of inequality they were exposed to and developed the confidence to demand better together. The shift to city life ultimately led to Chartism. Chartism began in 1839 when William Lovett of the Working Men's Association in London produced a document called the People's Charter, demanding 6 democratic reforms. The right to vote for all men over the age of 21, this was in the context of only about 4% of the population being able to vote at the time. Voting by secret ballot, so that voters couldn't be intimidated to vote a particular way by employers or landlords. No property qualification for members of Parliament, so that anyone could be elected regardless of wealth. Salaries for members of Parliament, again so that politics wasn't the preserve of the rich. Equal-sized constituencies, so that industrial areas with more working people would be represented on equal terms with rural areas. And finally, annual elections to hold representatives to account. The working people who supported the People's Charter believed that by gaining fair political representation, they would have a better chance of passing laws that would improve their lives. For example, there was a lot of pressure on the Tory government in the 1830s to abolish the Corn Laws, which made bread artificially expensive for workers. The Tories refused to budge. Lovett wrote, "The laws which make food dear and those which by making money scarce makes labour cheap must be abolished. Taxation must be made to fall on property, not on industry. The good of the many, as it is the only legitimate end, so must it be the sole study of the government." The People's Charter quickly gained traction, and in May 1839 the Chartists presented a petition to the House of Commons with almost 1.3 million signatures.
That's 10% of Britain's entire population at the time.
The petition blamed...
And 3 miles of paper.
The petition blamed...
Can you just think of the challenges in collating 3 miles of paper 200 years ago?
The petition blamed economic problems such as low demand and low profits, which led to low wages, unemployment, poverty and starvation, on the ignorant foolishness of their rulers. The signatories felt deceived by the 1832 Reform Act, which, while it had increased the number of voters, failed to improve anything for the vast majority of working people. So they reiterated the demands of the People's Charter from the previous year. But the British Parliament voted by 235 votes to 46 not to even consider the document. So if all of your peaceful arguments and campaigns have hit a brick wall, what do you do then?
They even tried a poem.
That's right, John Frost sent a poem to the Home Secretary.
We should recite the poem.
Let's not worry about the poem.
"'Tis time that the victims of labour and care should forereap what is labour's fair share. 'Tis time that these voice in the councils be heard, the rather than pay for the law of the sword. All power is ours, with a will of our own. We conquer, united, divided, we groan."
Beautiful, Schrödinger.
There are 2 more verses.
Maybe save it for the end.
Philistine.
So, if all of your peaceful arguments and campaigns have hit a brick wall, and you've even written a poem to the Home Secretary, what do you do then? There was no clear answer, and the Chartists started to split. One faction, which included William Lovett, believed the moral strength of their arguments could and should still achieve their aims. Another faction, including men such as Fergus O'Connor and John Frost,
The poet.
yes, the poet, John Frost and Fergus O'Connor believed, however unwillingly, that there was no viable option but physical force.
Which brings us to South Wales.
Which brings us to South Wales. The area was full of industrial workers suffering under low wages, high unemployment, poor health and soaring child mortality rates. The local authorities also regularly detained Chartist leaders, which antagonised the workers, who became more intent on an armed rebellion. John Frost, who was actually a former mayor of Newport, planned with publican Zephaniah Williams and watchmaker William Jones to lead a march down from the valleys in order to free a group of Chartists who had been detained by police in the Westgate Hotel. About 9,000 iron workers and miners armed with pikes, guns and various tools arrived in Newport on the night of the 3rd of November 1839. There's some debate over who fired first, but the majority view is that it was probably the Chartists. The local authorities were prepared and soldiers were defending the hotel. 22 marchers were killed and tens more were injured. 4 soldiers were hurt and none were killed. A local newspaper reported, "In about 20 minutes the work of destruction was finished. The soldiers had done their duty and the Chartists were running in all directions." John Frost, Zephaniah Williams and William Jones were caught and tried for high treason. The jury recommended mercy, but the judge sentenced the 3 men to be hanged, drawn and quartered. However, thanks to a public outcry at the harshness of the sentence, it was commuted to lifelong transportation, and that was the last time anyone was sentenced to hanging, drawing and quartering in Britain. The riot failed to achieve its goals. It neither provoked a wave of similar uprisings around the UK, nor did it establish any democratic rights for workers by itself. In fact, the violence elicited negative reactions from the non-Chartist populace. So the use of violence in pursuit of Chartist goals was seriously undermined. Where it did succeed, however, was in showing that the authorities were not impervious to public opinion. The government could not stamp down on challenges to its authority in the same way that it had in the past. Just a few years earlier, the Merthyr Rising of 1831 had led to the public execution of at least one participant. The public support for the leaders of the Newport Rising saved their lives. Both the government and the Chartists seemed to accept the value of a more conciliatory approach. The Newport Rising led to a society in which attempts at political change are largely non-violent, and the state's response to protest is far less draconian. In 1854, after 15 years abroad, they were even pardoned, with John Frost returning to Newport as a hero in 1856. Despite the rejection of the 1838 Charter, this was tangible evidence that a non-violent campaign using moral force could still be a way forward for the Chartists. The Chartists weren't giving up yet, they'd only just got started, but that's a story for another video. If you enjoyed this video, you might be interested in one of our other videos on the history of democracy in Britain, about the levellers of the English Civil War. Thanks for watching and hope to see you next time.